I'm beginning to think I need to be a duck. Get around a lot easier outside. So, last week we got into the Pharisees and we started talking a little bit more about the history of the Jewish people and how they got to where they started splitting up from their religious beliefs. And again, I still want to equate that to kind of what's going on today. If you look at how many denominations we have of the Christian church, it's really not that much different. And like I said at the very beginning of all this, there can be one thing that splits one church from another, or there can be vast oceans of things that split. And so, the basic, what we have to remember is we got to stay in the Bible. If we don't stay in the Bible, what happened to the Jews is what's been happening to the Christian church for the last, I don't know how many hundreds of years, but it seems like it's gotten a lot worse over the last 40 for sure. When you start seeing churches that have a 20,000 people congregation, but yet they don't seem to be teaching anything about God. And, so again, kind of comes down to us. We've got to keep focused. So that's where we're going to be at tonight. So this is going to be a little bit more history than Bible tonight, but it lends itself to why these things happen. So we're going to talk about the Levites. Remember, we talked about the different tribes, and of course, we know the Levites were the priests. They were technically one of the 12 tribes, but they end up being the 13th tribe because they are part of all tribes, because they go out with every tribe that has land, and they have synagogues and they have temples. The Levites go with every tribe. So technically they are a tribe, but they are a part of every other tribe also. So the Levites are what split. They become the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. So that's where the big division starts to occur. So we're going to talk tonight. We talked a little bit about who the Sadducees are. We know the Pharisees from the Bible because Jesus talked about the Pharisees. All of Matthew chapter 23 was a rebuke against them. And he also mentioned the scribes, and we're going to get into them later on. But the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they split. They were the same group of priests. They were Levites, and they were the priests. And so we're going to talk about them before they actually did this split. Again, they came through the line of Jacob. They were from the son of Levi. Levi had three sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Now, each one of these sons was given a task, and it all had to do with the temple and the priesthood. So when transporting the temple, each clan had different duties. Remember, Moses has the Israelites wandering through the wilderness. Every time they camped, we showed how they built the camps in the northeast, south, and west with the Levites in the middle. So each of these had a different job that they were supposed to carry out. So Kohath, his family would carry and transport the ark and all of the temple accoutrements, everything that went inside the temple. Gershon, they carried the curtains, and Merari carried the beams, sockets, and bars. So nothing fell to any of the other tribes. Everything stayed within the Levites, starting with these three. And in later generations, as the population grew, they divided into what they call mishmarat, and these were guards. And if remember, Moses actually tasked the Levites with going and basically killing everybody who was worshiping the golden calf. And so they are not a warrior class, but they definitely have some warriors in there. So they were also the guards of the temple. So they guarded the temple. And so each group served for a week in the temple, and every time when their week was up, they called them mishmars. So the kind of a hard words to say, but so these mishmars were the guards, and every week they would rotate to who was guarding the temple that week. So the descendants of Moses and his brother Aaron, again, they're through Levi, before the temple in Jerusalem, they set up and took down all the portable temple. There was no fixed temple like there was in Jerusalem. We hear about the temple that David actually started, but Solomon built the first temple. But up until then, all these temples were portable, except for in some of the smaller towns. But once they got out while they were traveling the wilderness, it was always portable. So the Levites were the only group supposedly not to worship the golden calf. We talked a little bit about that last week. But we know that's not technically true. They did participate in the worship, but then they were the ones that came back first. And, of course, remember what Aaron said, I just threw the gold in the fire and out came the calf. So, so they became the Levites became the priests of the Hebrew religion, and they were given the most sacred tasks of the worship. So everything that was done, anybody who got up and spoke at that time, they were all from this tribe of Levi. Whoops. And they had no land, and that was because every tribe, when they got a land, ended up having the Levites come with them. So every town had Levite priests. Every place they put a synagogue, every place they put a temple, the Levite priests would go there. So they technically didn't have their own land, but they served in the temple. This is where the history starts, but this is where things start to kind of fall apart for the Jews. And it starts kind of with Alexander the Great. In around 332 BC, Alexander the Great is conquering basically the whole known world at that time. I mean, he's everywhere from Russia all the way down south into India, and he's conquered everything. He's traveling by elephant. They fight wars on the elephants. So he's taken vast amounts of land. But in 332 BC, he actually invades the Holy Land, and they conquered it. So the Jews, once they conquered this, they actually were allowed to keep their religion, their theocracy, but they had to be ruled by the Greeks. And so the sects of the Hebrew priests started to divide around this time. We know that around 147 BC is when the Pharisees kind of came into existence. But there's a division that's starting to occur from the time of Alexander on. And the reason is, we're going to get into, is who did they follow? Did they follow God, or did they follow the society that was being created? Which is kind of where we're at now. Because what happens is we start seeing society shift, and over generations, and we talked about this in the men's group a couple weeks ago on Tuesday, we think about generation being 70 years or 120 years or 50 years, but when you think about it, it's really 20 years. And I had kids when I was around 20. They had kids when they were around 20. But as these kids grow up, every 5 years is when these kids have a major change. From 1 to 5, your kids are very dependent on you. From 6 to 10, they're starting to become a little bit more independent. They can start doing things on their own. They start thinking. But from 10 to 15, we all know what that age is like. And then from 15 to 20, they're kind of young adults. And then from 20 on, they become. So every 5 years, these kids are learning something new. And it's really, who are they around that's teaching it? So when you start thinking about how the Jewish society fit that same mold, so what they were starting to see is more of a Greek culture taking over the Jewish culture at this time. So in 166, now this is a really important time. This is when the Maccabean revolt occurs. So I don't know if any of you heard about the Maccabees or the Maccabean revolt, but 166 BC, Matthias, the family's called the Hasmoneans, and they are a family of priests, Levitical priests, and they begin a revolt. And the reason they did was because when the Greeks came in, when Alexander the Great died, when he was dying, they asked him, who's going to take your kingdom? He had no children. Who's going to take your kingdom? Who's going to rule? Who's going to become the ruler? And he whispered, the strongest. So what that did is that set up a whole bunch of his generals to say, we're going to be the strongest. So there was 4 or 5 different ones, and I'm only going to get into one right now. His name was Ptolemy. So Ptolemy is one of these generals. He goes to Egypt, and he takes over the area of Egypt. And there was other ones that took over areas up near Rome and different places. But Ptolemy, so this family ends up putting rules on the Jewish people, saying that, you're no longer going to be able to. Same thing happened with Daniel during the Babylonian captivity. They said, you're no longer going to be able to worship your God the way you want to worship. You're going to worship us. You're going to worship Greek gods. You're going to do everything. And the one thing the Jews were steadfast about is they didn't do that. They did not ever turn away completely from God. Some of them turned somewhat away, but they never as a people turned away from God completely. And that's what causes this revolt. So the Maccabean revolt is basically, the Jews are saying, and it basically comes down to this one family, this Hasmonean family called the Maccabees. And 167, they finally win this. It's taken a couple years, but they finally defeat the Greeks enough that the Greeks leave them alone. And they step back. And this happens through Judah, the Maccabee, and he's one of the sons of Matthias. What they do in 167 BC is they go back to the temple. Remember, the Greeks have said, you're not going to worship God the way you want to worship him. You're going to worship our Greek gods. You're going to worship the way we say worship. They went back in, and actually Ptolemy went into the temple when they actually invaded the Holy Land, and he went into the Holy of Holies looking for, remember they worship idols, right? All these, the Greeks and the Romans, that Ptolemy actually walked into the Holy of Holies looking for what it is that these Jewish people were worshiping. And what's he find in the Holy of Holies? Nothing. Because we don't worship a God that's an idol. We worship a God that's here all the time in spirit all around us. They didn't understand that concept. So, but that destroys the purification of the temple when they go in there and do that. So in 167, Judah the Maccabee decides they're going to re-purify and rededicate the temple. Now, y'all ever heard of Hanukkah? Anybody know what Hanukkah actually means? We think of it like Christmas because it happens at Christmas time for us, right? It's not Jewish Christmas. The word Hanukkah means dedication. And what it is in 167, when they rededicate this temple, the dedication ceremony that they used is Hanukkah. And that is what every year when the Jews do Hanukkah, that's what they're doing. They're going back and they're celebrating this particular recertification, repurification, and rededication of their temple. And that's what Hanukkah is all about. So it all comes from this Maccabean revolt. Now, at this point, after the revolt, the Jewish people have about 80 years where they have autonomy. They're not really ruled by the Greeks anymore. There's influence all around because you have Decapolis, which Decapolis is an area north or east of Galilee, and the word Deca, it means 10. So it's the 10 Greek cities. And so there's influence all around the Holy Land of Greek cities, Greek people. And so there's a lot of intermixing at this point. But for 80 years, the Jews pretty much run their own society again. And that's until the Romans come in. And there's a reason the Romans come in. And it's basically because two brothers have an argument. And they can't get over their argument. And we're going to go into that here, hopefully, tonight. So around 63 BC, Rome invades Judea, and they make all of Israel a Roman province. Okay, and we're going to talk about how that occurred real quick. And I know this doesn't sound like this has anything to do with the Sadducees, but it does, because this is the basis where everything starts to change from Jewish belief to more secular belief, the worldly belief, the Greek belief, the Roman belief. So after the Maccabean revolt, a man by the name of John Hyrcanus becomes the king and high priest of Israel. This is around 134 to 104, his death. So he's got a pretty good control for these years of Israel. But he was heavily influenced by what we're going to call the Sadducees. And it was actually, they were more Hellenists at this point. The Helen is the mother of Alexander the Great. She had a lot of Greek influence in the Holy Land. And so the Sadducees end up coming out of that Hellenization of the Jewish people. And again, when you start thinking about our society today, we don't teach kids in school the things that we were taught in school. They're now learning things that are very secular. So if you kind of equate that to the Greeks coming into the Holy Land, their children are being taught more about Greek society now than they're being taught about the Jewish society. And that's what the Hellenists were. And the Sadducees were heavily influenced by these Hellenists. And at one point, they get control, and they remove all the Pharisees from the Sanhedrin Council. The Sanhedrin Council is the Jewish council, and once they start to split, these fractures occur, and you got the Sadducees against the Pharisees. The Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. They don't believe in afterlife. The Pharisees do. And so there's a big split on the theology of what these two groups, even though they're Jewish, both groups, they don't believe the same thing anymore. And so under Hyrcanus, Israel was pretty powerful. It was able to withstand the Romans and mainly the Greeks. But then as he gets older and dies, his oldest son, Judah Aristobulus, now look at the name Aristobulus. That is definitely not a Hebrew name, right? That's more of a Greek name, or what we consider a Greek name. But he was named in memory of Judah the Maccabee, who was the man who rededicated the temple after they defeated the Greeks. And so he becomes king and high priest. Now he has a brother named Alexander Jannaeus. And he starts to worry about whether his brother is going to try to take his power. So he puts his brother in prison. And so he's king for about a year, and he dies. So Alexander Jannaeus is left out of prison, and he becomes the king. So careful what you do with your brothers, because they might come back and bite you. So in one day, Alexander Jannaeus went from prison to the throne. And again, I know this doesn't sound like this is going to have anything to do with where we're headed as far as these, but this is really important to why these groups broke up and what they believe. To this day, some of the problems that happen in Israel are because of all this. Under Jewish law, he married his brother's widow. And that was, we read back in Deuteronomy, it talks about when your brother dies, you marry the widow and take his children. So the thing about him, though, he was a great warrior and a good politician. So he was able to really kind of control things for a little while. It was a very volatile region. And the land of Israel is not very big, but he was able to keep that small area of Israel a pretty good empire. I mean, they were safe. They had autonomy. They controlled themselves. They weren't under Greek control. They weren't under Roman control. And he believed in the Greek and the Roman belief that the highest honor was to die in battle. That was one of his failings. And there's an old Greek saying that parents would say either they'd give their son a shield and send him to war, and they'd say either go to battle and either come back on it or with it. So even parents would say, we don't care how you come back as long as you're either on your shield or carrying your shield. Because it was greatest honor was to die in battle. And, that's kind of Viking culture. And that's one of the things where I know so many people right now, if you see everything that people are watching on TV, I've got a nephew that they're so into this Viking culture, and they're starting to believe these same things again, that the Vikings, these beliefs are not different than what the Vikings believed. But it's amazing how today there's so many people being influenced by the Norse culture and the gods of the Norse, believe me. And that's happening in the prisons. Believe it or not, they're getting these. It used to be that these people were becoming Muslimized in prisons. Now they're becoming, in prison, they're teaching them to become Norse and believing in the Norse gods. And that's actually happening in the prisons very heavily right now. So he becomes pretty unpopular with the masses because most people don't want their children to be sent off to war. And this guy was very war mongering person. I mean, he was, to keep power, to keep control, he was constantly having to fight somebody to keep them off the borders. So people got tired of sending their kids to war, their children to war, and so he kind of became unpopular with everyday Jews. Now, the Pharisees, this is the big split now. The Pharisees are very Jewish in their thought process, in the way they live their lives, the way they do things. The Sadducees are very Greek in their thinking. And so the Pharisees become vocal against this king because he's now leaning more toward the Greek theology and the Greek ways of doing things than the Jewish way of doing things. And so there were a number of situations that brought this kind of to a head. On Sukkot, one of the Jewish holidays, one of the pilgrimage festivals, 1,000 Jews from all over the land flocked to Jerusalem, filled the temple courtyard, and during the height of the most joyous part of the festival, now this is how Greek this guy became, Jannaeus, as the high priest, he performed a key part of the ceremony in an openly, it says here, I wrote Sadducee way, and it's true, but it's really a Greek way. Instead of doing it the way the Jews did their ceremonies, he did it the way the Greeks would have done it, and that's where the Sadducees, he was very much a Sadducee at that point. They performed a key part of it, and he intentionally provoked a public declaration on behalf of the Sadducees, and he knew that his audience was overwhelmingly made up of Pharisees. Now, we're not talking about Pharisee priests here. We're talking about people who believed in what the Pharisees believed. Okay, so there's a difference between, it's like us. We have pastors and we have people that are leaders, but we're still Christians. So And that's kind of what this is. So they responded by pelting him with citron fruits used as part of the observance in the festival. In his wrath, he ordered his non-Jewish mercenary soldiers into the temple to slaughter all at will, and they butchered 6,000 Jews that day. And in Josephus, he recounted it more than a century and a half later, when he wrote this, the troughs of the temple ran red with Jewish blood, because the Jews were now angry at their king, so the king kills that many Jews. So now you've got this huge division from the power structure to the people. The power structure is now leaning Greek. The people are still wanting to be Jewish. So now you've got open civil war occurs. Jannaeus tried to arrest every Pharisee. Most of them got away, and those that he caught were executed, many by crucifixion, which he learned from the Romans. And in one incident, he had 800 Jewish men nailed to crucifixes in one day along the road to Jerusalem. So if you were riding into Jerusalem, you would have seen crosses with 800 people in one day. And what's worse about this is not only did he nail these men to the crosses, he actually, while the men were on the crosses still alive, he executed the men's wives and children in front of them. This guy was not a nice guy. And so the Pharisees asked the leader of the Syrian Greeks, Demetrius, to intervene and overthrow Jannaeus. And again, now we're starting to see a really big division here coming up for Israel. Demetrius attacked Jerusalem. The problem was he had Jewish soldiers in his army, and one of the problems was those people deserted. They did not want to fight their own countrymen. So Jannaeus at this point calls for a truce with the Pharisees. And I apologize if this is a little bit boring, but this is an interesting point right here. Queen Salome is Jannaeus' wife, and she was instrumental in getting this truce put in place. So she's kind of bartering for the peace for this to happen. One of her brothers is a Rabbi Simon ben Shattah, and he was a Pharisee who was hiding, because remember, all the Pharisees are supposed to be arrested and killed. When they got this truce done, her brother is now put in control. Remember, all the Pharisees were kicked off the Sanhedrin Council. Now you got a Pharisee coming in, her brother, and he's now in charge of the Sanhedrin Council. So now you're shifting back from being Sadducee and Greek-led to being more Pharisee and Jewish-led. Again, it's a big back and forth here. But here's another problem. So you got Jannaeus, who's very Greek in his thinking, running the government, and you have Pharisees that are running the people. So you've got the Jewish people that want to follow the Pharisees, but you've got a ruler and a king who's much more Greek in his thought. And it's got to be tough, especially if you look at how diligent the Jewish people were to their faith. So what does Simon do? He decides, well, you guys kicked all the Pharisees off, so now I'm going to kick all the Sadducees off. So now the Sadducees are out of the Sanhedrin Council. And so eventually they were all removed, not only from the council, but completely from the priesthood and education. And if you know anything about Jewish education, all the Jewish schools are rabbinical schools. They're all you train your children in these schools that are run by rabbis. So now you have the Pharisees are now taking charge and saying, we're not teaching our kids Greek anymore and how to live as a Greek. We're going to teach them back as how to live as a Jew. So now we've gone back, because when the Sadducees were in control, they were teaching the children more Greek ways of life, which gets confusing. And again, think about society now. We send our kids to school. We have no idea what our teachers really teach them in the classroom unless we were sitting there watching it. And this we knew because you had two different factions. So this gave control of what the people thought and did to the Pharisees. So after Jannaeus died, and this is something I think is just fascinating. I never knew this until I started doing this study weeks ago for the men's group. He died in 104 BC. Salome, now, we all talked about how much power a woman had in Jewish society. Women were basically, they couldn't testify in court. They had no power. They weren't allowed to do basically anything. Salome becomes queen of the Jews. So when Jannaeus dies, she has two young sons that aren't old enough to become king yet. So her brother, remember, now is the head of the Pharisees. He's now head of the Sanhedrin Council. So she becomes queen of Jerusalem, of the Israelites, of Israel. And the interesting thing was, if history says she was actually a really good queen, and she ran it well. But she had two sons, Hyrcanus, who was a Pharisee, and Aristobulus, who was more of a Sadducee, believed in Greek tradition. So she's got two sons that have two different ways of thinking. So the Pharisees asked her to rule the government, and like I said, the people liked her, and she did a pretty good job of running the government. But her sons were very different, and she was worried that they were going to fight each other and actually, as they get older, cause another civil war. And so she appoints Hyrcanus as the high priest, and she gives Aristobulus some fortified cities, making him kind of a governor of certain cities. The problem with that was he decided to fortify a whole lot more cities, preparing for a war, while his other brother is the high priest. So Salome ruled until her death in 67 BC, and after her death, Hyrcanus becomes king. Now remember, he's the high priest. So 3 months later, Aristobulus, who's been fortifying cities and building armies, decides to go to war against his brother. Now this is where I said, the whole reason Israel was turned over to the Romans was because two brothers had an argument and they couldn't figure out how to get along. So what they do is they go to a Roman general named Pompey, and they ask him to arbitrate in behalf of both of them. And what does Pompey do? He takes advantage of it. He comes in, he says, okay, you two brothers want to argue amongst yourselves, I'll let you, and I'll come in here and pretend that I'm going to arbitrate this. He ends up taking power of all, in the name of Rome, he takes power in the name. Now, he doesn't do it for Caesar like you would think, but he does it because he's a Roman soldier, he's a general. He now has control of the whole Holy Land, all of Israel, and he's got these two brothers who just want to squabble. So basically, the whole reason when Christ came to earth that the Romans were in charge of the city of Jerusalem and all of Israel was because Aristobulus and Hyrcanus couldn't get along, and they had a sibling squabble. And because of the way they were squabbling, because one was Greek and one was more Jewish, now they aren't Greek or Jewish. Now they're going to have Roman rule. So in 42, Julius Caesar actually came in and he fought Pompey and took control of Rome over Judea. Now, this is where the Sadducees really kind of come into play, because once Roman rule comes in, the Sadducees really fit with Roman rule, because remember, the Sadducees are already leaning very heavily toward the Greek way of life and the way the Greeks do things. Maybe not so much in the Greek gods yet, but I'm sure there was a lot of that also. Because remember, the Greeks had Zeus, they had Hera, they had Apollo, they had Neptune, they had Mars. They had a god for everything. So the Sadducees, remember, there were about 6,000 Pharisees. There were only about 1,000 Sadducees at the time of Christ. So they were not a huge group by the time Christ comes to earth. And remember, all this is happening just a couple hundred years before Christ's birth. And so for about 200 years, during that 200-year period, there's this huge turmoil and shakeup, and who's controlling it? Is it the Greeks? Is it the Romans? Is it the Jews? And it just goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until Rome steps in, and Rome's like, we got this, and we're going to take it. And so they put a foot down on everyone. So the common people, because of the suspicions, because the Sadducees collaborated with the Romans, the Sadducees were not real well liked by the Jewish people. They followed the Pharisees much more, because the Pharisees at least appeared, at least on the surface, to be much more Jewish in the way they taught and the way they preached and the way they did things. But the Sadducees did not agree at all on theology with the Pharisees. And we'll do this and then we'll stop for the night. But so not only did they reject the Pharisees' oral law, but they diverged on them on a bunch of different things, ritual purity. So the Sadducees basically only believed that in the first 5 books of the Torah that Moses wrote. Everything that came after that, they didn't study. They didn't teach it. They didn't preach it. They didn't care about it. But the Pharisees taught everything that was in the Old Testament. So what we see as the Old Testament now was more Pharisee teaching But the Sadducees would not have taught that even at this time. They only taught the first 5 books of Moses, of the Bible. So this is the things that they were most different on. They held that the Torah alone, the first 5 books, was of divine authority. The rest of the prophet writings they didn't think it had any divine inspiration at all. They rejected the notion of life after death. They thought when you died, you died. You're done. That's it. They denied the existence of angels and demons. And it's kind of interesting if you read Genesis how you could think that you would have a group of priests deny angels and demons when you can read Genesis 6 and see it all over the place. But they didn't believe in it. They rejected the resurrection of the dead. So they could not have believed in a Messiah and in any way if you can't have any resurrection. So now not only do they not believe in resurrection of a human, but they don't even believe, at least in my opinion, they can't really believe that there's even going to be a Messiah that comes, because the Messiah has to raise from the dead to do what he's going to do. And they also believe that humans completely have free will, that there's no God inspiration, there's no divine intervention, nothing. And whatever you do, you do. And it's 100% your will, not have nothing to do with God. And for some people, that's probably true. So during the Maccabean revolt, the Sadducees combined the priesthood and the thrones of the Jews under one of their own, Simon Maccabeus. He's the older brother of Judas Maccabeus. Again, we talked about this already. So this is, like I said, this is the division. That point where we talk about Hanukkah, that's the dividing line for the Jews. It's not just that Hanukkah is their belief and their celebration of resurrecting and repurifying and dedicating their temple. This is also the dividing point, really, of their culture, of believing in either Jewish faith, Jewish law, the way Jewish things happen, or are you going to be more secular and believe in Roman or Greek thinking? And believe me, it was a huge, huge division here. And later with John the Baptist, he said, but when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to where he was baptizing, he said to them, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not think you can say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. I tell you that out of these stones, God can raise up children for Abraham. The axe is already at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. And if you don't understand how big an insult that was, vipers, when a viper snake has babies, the babies chew their way out of the mother and kill the mother. This is one of the biggest insults you can give. So when John says this to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, remember, their whole culture is based on honor and shame. You don't want to have any shame. You want to have everything. You want to be honorable. Everything needs to be honor. So when he calls them a brood of vipers, he's basically saying, you're as low as these snakes that chew their way out of their mother. That's a pretty big insult. So it's not a wonder why the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't like John the Baptist very much. We're going to stop right there for tonight, only because it's 7 o'clock and it's with the weather. I don't want to keep you all any longer. Any questions, any thoughts, Sorry, it was kind of more of a history lesson. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, they were priests, the Sadducees. What did they believe, other than all the laws?
Well, they believed everything that was written in the Torah, according to, and that's what they taught on. So when you would have went, we talked about last week about how when you followed a rabbi, when you were young, you went to the school, and then after you reached a certain level of education, you could choose a rabbi to follow because you either went into your father's profession or you became something, or you could go into the priesthood, especially if you were a Levite. And so if you decide, you could pick a rabbi to follow, and you could get that rabbi to teach you more. And then if you got to a certain level under that rabbi, the rabbi would then turn around after a certain age, and these guys had to memorize everything. So these guys had to memorize the whole Torah, all 5 books. And I don't mean write it down and look at it on a card. They memorized it. They could read it out of their head. I don't know how they did it. I can't do it, and I have a pretty good memory. But so when they taught specifically on the first 5 books of the Torah, what they call the Law of Moses. They didn't get into anything else. Where the Pharisees taught everything, including Ruth and including, Kings and Chronicles and all that. None of that existed for the Sadducees. So, so they only looked at the law as the law. And that's what the first 5 books of the Torah are called, is the law. And so that was all they cared about. And that's, again, one of the reasons that it became the whole reason what Christ says several times. I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. And that's really those 5 books. And that's all they would have really preached on in the synagogues where they were in charge.
But they saw what Moses went through
Mm-hmm.
and how God provided for the people.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't all.
But remember, now you're a couple thousand years back, and so their memories were short. Because look at what happened even when they were traveling in the wilderness. Moses is on the mountain for 40 days, and they forget about Moses and go make a golden calf, And so I don't want to say that majority of the Hebrews had short memories, but they certainly had short attention spans because they couldn't stay faithful very long. That's what it seems like to me and I think that's just human nature in some ways. We all struggle with how faithful we are from day to day. We get up, we get busy doing something, and if we let culture creep in too much, we can find ourselves going down. The good thing about our faith, and the more you read the Bible, the more we understand the Bible, the more we study the Bible, we have those moments where we catch ourselves and say, okay, I need to pull myself back. They relied on the priests for everything. They had the Day of Atonement. They would go to the priest once a year, and they would get the Day of Atonement where they would be forgiven for all their sins for the whole year, but only for that 1 year. So they didn't have what we have. We have Christ that comes one time, and we're forgiven for our sins for all time by one man in one act, and at one time, the moment we choose to follow that path. They didn't have that option. Their option was every year they go to the priest, and they'd have to go to the temple, and they'd have to do the sacrifice, and then they would be forgiven, and they would have their atonement for that year, but that was only for the previous year. It didn't count the year coming up. You got to do it again. And that's the way they taught. Yes, sir.
They did not believe in resurrection.
No.
They did believe in Messiah. And the reason they could do that is because they had no clue how the Messiah was coming.
Right.
Remember, they were expecting a general
Yeah.
might come in and take charge. And the other thing is they didn't believe the prophets, so they didn't read those scriptures about Christ coming back.
Yeah, they would have never read Isaiah. Isaiah wouldn't even been a book they even saw. And Ezekiel and so, but right.
Apostle Paul was a Pharisee.
He was Pharisee. Yeah, his teacher was Gamaliel. So, anything else? Like I said, I know history's kind of boring, but that sets up. Not really. Okay, good. I'm fascinated by this stuff, and so I tell Diane all the time. It always when I start doing this stuff, and especially for the men's group, I don't know if everybody else is interested in what I'm interested in. So when you get up here and you do this, you're hoping people are interested in what you're interested in. But I know people that hated history when I was in school, but I loved history. I liked science. Some people hated science. Put me in English class, and I could sleep through every English class I ever had. so anyway, I appreciate that. But this history is going to start really becoming important as we go forward onto what's getting ready to happen, and it really sets up for what Pastor John just said. The whole 3 years of Jesus' ministry starts to become based out of it's based on all of history, but it really focuses on what happened from the Maccabees until he shows up on earth. And so that's why this history right here is kind of important. And like I said, I didn't know what Hanukkah was until I started studying this. I just thought it was another Jewish holiday. But it's actually the dedication of that temple whenever they fought off the Greeks, only to lose it again to the Romans, because you go down a couple more kings, and one king fights it off, and he brings it back to being Jewish. A couple of his descendants later, they lose it all back to for the same reasons that they lost it in the first place. Short memory. And I'm a firm believer in this. Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. if you don't study it, because I don't think there's anything new on earth. It all's happened before. We've talked about Old Testament versus New Testament. It's all there. It's all kind of happened the same way. It's just different things. But when you start putting the pieces together, you see the puzzle, on both sides. So, anything else? Well, I appreciate y'all listening to me. So, let's pray, and we'll let y'all go home. Father, thank you again for this day, even with all the rain. I'm sure in August we're going to be praying for the rain as much as we are not loving it today. For everyone here has a family member that needs to be prayed for, we ask for you to come and minister to them in their heart. It's always your will, not our will. But help us with the understanding we need to carry that on through the future. Allow us to be the light of Christ as we encounter others. Help us, as they talked about earlier, to help this. We can only help the community we're in, but if we can serve this community and help this community find its way to you, we can change the world through you, or you can change the world through us. Hopefully we'll have that opportunity. We pray for this country and what's fixing to happen tomorrow. It's scary, but we're not to have fear. You have it all under your control and your understanding, and we don't need to understand it. We just need to follow and do our part, knowing that everything in Revelation has to happen for your coming. And as far as I'm concerned, you can't come back soon enough. So, again, bless us where you'll bless us. Forgive us where we fail you. Have mercy on us where you'll have mercy. Again, let us be the light that you can shine through us to help someone in need today, tomorrow, and every day going forward. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.